Hank Jones is another one of these musicians who, first of all, they're technically beyond criticism, and so they basically can work as much as they want to work. I remember listening to two white studio musicians in a bus once talking about how they were going to plan the coming year. And one of them said that the first thing he does is he gets together with his accountant and they decide how much money he should make. And then they decide how much work he's going to accept because he's a studio guy. Now, for a long time, blacks just did not have access to that kind of studio thing. But with it or without it, a musician like Hank Jones can pretty much decide how much he wants to work because he's utterly dependable. Everybody wants to have a musician like that around because you don't have to worry about anything. He can hear, he can play anything. He has exemplary taste. He's a great stylist. He's all of those things. The thing about Hank Jones is that he's been able to maintain these two rather different professions in a way. He's a great jazz star. He's also a great jazz accompanist. And for a long time, for 17 years actually, he was a studio guy. A faceless, rather anonymous figure who joined the CBS studio in '59, remained there until they got rid of their studio orchestra. For a while, there was a talk show in the morning that he was the band, solo piano. He just played intro in and out of commercials, things like that. Just seemed to be having a good time at it and was paid very well. But the same period, you know, he'd go into the studio and or he'd put together a trio with guys like Ron Carter and Tony Williams or Buster Williams, or at one point he had Dave Holland and Billy Higgins and George Moran. I mean, all these really kick-ass musicians, most of whom were half his age. And he never dated. He never dates. That's the thing about Hank. He really never does. He creates there's such a high level. Now, Hank was born in 1918 in Mississippi. And then his family moved to Pontiac, Michigan, which is where he grew up. And he was the first of the three legendary Jones brothers. Thad came later, trumpet player, big band leader, great composer-arranger, one of the central composer-arrangers of the post-war period. And then Elvin came, who was probably the single most influential drummer of his generation, or certainly a candidate. Hank is very different. Hank was playing, he was born in 1918, and he started playing professionally by the time he was 13, or was at least performing, in and around Michigan and I think occasionally Ohio. So that's 1931. And that's really early on in the jazz story. Again, there's no swing era yet, let alone bebop. And he starts working with musicians in the area. And as he gets older, he starts going out with territory orchestras, as Clark Terry had. And in one of them, he meets Lucky Thompson. And it was Lucky Thompson who brought him to New York. I think it was 1944. So the bebop thing is just beginning to, it's already been germinating for 3 or 4 years, but nobody really knows it outside of the musician circle because they haven't much recorded. The big recording is going to take place in '45. After the recording ban, suddenly it's going to be Coco, and it's going to be Salt Peanuts, and Bird and Dizzy are going to be everywhere. But as soon as he comes into town, now he grew up, who were the guys he listened to? It's really interesting. I mean, the 4 greatest pianists of the pre-war era are his idols. This would not be surprising to anybody. Earl Hines, Fats Waller, Teddy Wilson, Art Tatum. Doesn't sound like any one of the 4. I mean, I guess I hear the least Hines in his playing, except maybe there's some rhythmic change-ups that I will do that might put you in mind of Hines. He can play stride beautifully when he wants to, so I guess you could say that's a little Fats, a little Tatum. He has a very, like a silvery touch on the keyboard, which might remind you of, I don't think so much Teddy Wilson, because Teddy Wilson really rings it like bells. He's almost like pistons. I mean, he really gets a very musical quality, whereas Hank is much lighter. But it's not Tatum's touch, it's not Teddy's touch, it's his own touch. And when he comes to New York, he's already got all of this facility, and he starts listening to the young guys who play the far out harmonies and different kinds of melodies, and he absorbs this immediately. And he becomes one of the dependable guys that the beboppers are going to use. Charlie Parker, when they were on JATP, usually Norman would put Hank to play with Parker. They did 2 recording sessions together. But he doesn't sound like any of his contemporaries in the bop era. He certainly doesn't sound like Monk. He doesn't sound like Bud Powell. Because those melodious qualities that come from Teddy Wilson and Tatum and that earlier period are there at the same time that he's filling them out with much more sophisticated harmonies. And, or I wouldn't say more sophisticated than Tatum, but modern harmonies that fit in with the bop frame of mind. And those long, fast, intricate, knotty kinds of melodic lines that Parker and Gillespie and Powell put on the map. Just at a point when a lot of the figures from bebop are beginning to take off in one way or another, they're trying to achieve some kind of a, commercial personality in the early 50s. Some of them get together with the Modern Jazz Quartet, and Miles starts to put together groups, and Charlie Parker's not having an easy time of it, but for all his fame, Dizzy is trying to keep a big band. He disbands, he puts together smaller groups. Everybody's trying to figure out a way to survive. And Hank goes to work for Ella Fitzgerald for something like 5 years. He becomes her accompanist. Arguably the greatest singer in jazz at the period, certainly one of the 2 or 3. And again, it's a kind of facelessness. There's a kind of modesty about Hank that you see in him and that really is part of his career. And then in the mid-50s and late 50s, he's mostly in New York. He's recording. He's one of Benny Goodman's favorite pianists. He tours with Benny, goes to the Far East. At the same time, he's frequently involved in bands with the trombonist Tyree Glenn. In one of those bands, I just realized this the other day, Lester Young and Elvin were also parts of this ensemble. I don't know if they ever recorded. I have to ask him about that. But the thing is, Gunther Schuller puts together a recording date, wants Hank Jones Trio. Benny Goodman wants a piano player, he wants Hank Jones. Whether it's bebop, avant-garde in the sense of the so-called third stream, or more traditional playing, ragtime. He made ragtime records in this period. Whatever it is, he can do it. And then in '59, he goes into the studios. And although he made a lot of recordings and turns up on a hell of a lot of albums in this period, he pretty much falls off the map for most people. I mean, this is the period when Bill Evans has become huge, when Cecil Taylor has first become the big controversial figure. Herbie Hancock comes onto the scene. At the end of the decade, it's Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett and those guys. And then in the mid-'70s, after this long period when jazz was sort of pushed to the edge by rock, and when all these musicians were using electric pianos and trying desperately to do some kind of thing with tracks and layers and find some kind of life in the recording studio, this is when he suddenly finds himself back, in the trenches without the security of the studio check, and almost instantly becomes the jazz piano player. It was incredible to watch this. Him and Tommy Flanagan, very similar backgrounds. Because I remember in the early '70s, there was a big thing of putting together all-star bop ensembles. You had Dizzy, you'd get Sonny Stitt. Occasionally you could get Monk, but then Monk became a recluse. And the chair that was always the one that never seemed to measure up to the legends, J.J. Johnson, all the other guys, Mingus, Max Roach, that you could find on every other instrument. The empty chair was the piano because, Bud had passed away. John Lewis was with the Modern Jazz Quartet. Who are you going to use? And at that time, people didn't think of Hank in that group. Hank wasn't one of the guys who invented the music. He wasn't venerated in the same way, nor was Flanagan. But by the mid-70s, things began to change, partly because of a Japanese record company that got the brilliant idea of putting together a group that they called the Great Jazz Trio, with two of Miles's most celebrated musicians from the 60s, Ron Carter and Tony Williams. Now, Ron and Tony had cachet, I mean, in spades. Everybody knew who they were. They were much younger, and they were still associated with the cutting edge. I mean, Ron Carter, was on every other record that came out, and Tony was, I said earlier that Elvin was the great drummer of his era. The only candidate would be the much, much younger, almost 20 years younger, Tony Williams, who at 17 was, driving everybody crazy with Miles. So you put those two together with Hank Jones, instantly Hank Jones gets a sexiness attached to him that hadn't really been there before. But the proof is either going to be there or not in the recording, and it really was. I mean, those records, I was just listening to Someday My Prince Will Come the other day. They're electrifying recordings. And he still as relaxed as ever. He's so laid back, but he's so perfect. One of my favorite records that he made in this period, because suddenly, after years in the studios, he seems to be making records on an almost daily basis. There were so many Hank records. He made one, which was also called The Trio, and it was with Bobby Rosengarten on drums, who at that time was mostly famous because he had led the Dick Cavett Orchestra on television, and Milt Hinton, who, probably the greatest living pre-Blanton bass player and one of the most, hardest working studio guys, played in every kind of context imaginable, from, going back from King Oliver to Aretha Franklin. There's just nothing Milt Hinton didn't do. And those guys are more swing than Bob. And there's Hank. And for some reason, it's one of those things that we love about jazz. You can't predict it. You don't know when it's going to happen. But the chemistry was just right. These three guys get into the studio. They all love each other. They sit down. They make one of the great records of that period. But the highlight of that record, as good as every trio selection on that record is that the producer, Hank O'Neill, asked Hank to play a solo piece. He had been working out an arrangement, a solo piano arrangement of Oh, What a Beautiful Morning, Rodgers and Hammerstein from Oklahoma, not a piece you associate with jazz. And it's one of my favorite piano recordings from any period. It's just gorgeous. I mean, everything that you love about Hank Jones is there in this performance. The originality of the arrangement, taking a non-jazz piece and turning it into a jazz piece. The clarity of every note is sort of like a chime. The perfect time, that almost goes without saying, the incredible taste. And then when the improvisation starts, the extraordinary control and originality as he spins variations that are on the chords, but that go so far from the melody, it's almost like a fantasia. And then he brings it back just so beautifully into the theme. And you really feel like you've been someplace. He tells a perfect story, does it in about 3 minutes. And that is the artistry of this music. And it doesn't call attention to itself. There isn't one measure where he does anything that's, well, get a load of this. He never does that. I once, one of the angriest pieces I ever wrote in The Voice was after hearing him at Tavern on the Green. Oh, God, I walked out of there with my wife, and I really wanted to go shoot some people because the audience just wouldn't stop talking. And Hank was up there, and he was playing superbly. And there was one table really close up to the bandstand. And I learned a lesson that evening because these weren't bad people. They just didn't understand. They thought he was there for background music, like you go to a Holiday Inn, there's some guy sitting in the lobby. They were from out of town. It was a big date for them. They came to have a good time and talk and have a conversation. And when the maitre d' or somebody walked over, because they were really acting as though clueless, and asked them to please keep it down, I saw the girl, the woman, young woman, look. Like for the first time she realized there was a guy playing. And then she looked around. Before that, they hadn't even realized that there was a artist audience. It was, for them, it was just, could have been music piped in. And then they got very embarrassed. And then they sat there, and I sort of felt a little sorry for them. This is not how they wanted to spend the evening. But this is what musicians have to put up with all the time, because the club doesn't say, welcome to this concert where we serve food. It's welcome to my restaurant, and oh yeah, there's a piano player for those of you who give a damn. But the other thing that I learned was that Hank didn't care. I asked John Lewis about that once, because John was doing the same thing at the Knickerbocker, and everybody was talking. I said, "It's John Lewis." I said, how can you stand this? And he said, "Are you kidding? I'm being paid to rehearse. He said, this is the ultimate gig. I don't need them to listen. I could be at home doing exactly the same thing, and nobody would pay me for it. So I take the subway downtown, and I get paid for 3 hours of rehearsal. This is one of the gifts that you get in this town." And I guess for Hank it's the same thing, you know. I don't think he played any differently at Tavern on the Green than he played at the Blue Note. Now, when he comes out of the Blue Note, you paid a hell of a lot of money to go hear Hank Jones. But it's the same guy. He's still playing at the same level. He doesn't throw it away. It's just, okay, some people are listening, some people aren't. He's playing what he knows. That's the only way that I can explain the phenomenon of a guy who's now 86 years old. And I wouldn't, you know, say that he gets better all the time, because that would be absurd. But he never slackens. He never loses anything. You know, Clark is the same way. When Hank celebrated, I can't remember now if it was 80th birthday at the Blue Note, or maybe it was the 85th. I'm sort of losing track of time. And all these great players dropped by to jam with him. And they were all playing and having a good time, and the audience was delighted to see all these celebrity musicians. But nobody cut Hank. I mean, he didn't try to, you know, he never makes a display. He never does that. But, you know, as soon as he played, everybody would, you know, quiet down, you'd listen, and you knew you were hearing a great artist who is completely in command of jazz, this amazing music that can be very beautiful and that reflects who you are and what you're feeling at the moment. And Hank sustains that. This piece that I wrote after going to the Tavern on the Green, I led it off with an anecdote. A couple of days later, I had been in line to buy some CDs at Tower. And there was a woman who was paying for some pop stuff, and she had her son with her, a small boy, and he said, "What's up the stairs?" And up the stairs was the jazz section, half jazz and half classical. But if you took those stairs, you were in jazz world, and signs made that very clear. And she said, "Oh, that's like quiet music." So we called the piece "Quiet Music." You know, that's a lot of people. It's just too subtle, and if the subtlety of the music puts you off, then you're not going to really understand the kind of artistry that Hank Jones represents, because he's just not interested in you know, demanding your attention. He merits your attention by the quality of his music, and either you hear it or you don't. This quality that Hank has of the consistency of his playing. There's no moodiness, no personality, you know, no personality problems. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you know, there's no musician in the history of jazz that I venerate more than Sonny Rollins. But if Sonny Rollins is having a bad day, you'll probably know it. It's not that he'll do anything unkind or anything. It's just that he won't be playing very well because he needs to be on to be on. And then there's this other kind of professionalism that's exemplified by somebody like Hank Jones or Clark Terry, where you just never see them off. I mean, it's a kind of professionalism. They're there to do what they do, and they're going to, you know, Hank is always on. But it's also a part of his personality. He's very laid back. You know, for a while he worked on, he led the big band that backed Bing Crosby when he made his return to the stage in New York in 1976. But Joe Bushkin was in the small group, and Hank was the big band. So, you know, I thought he might have a story or something. And while I was talking to him, I realized that of all the 300 interviews I've done, Hank probably comes closest to Bing in being laid back. You know, I just remember the way he was even standing there. He was just, you know, he's just cool. He's just doing what he does, and he's a great artist, and he may, you know, and this quality of always being there, it seems to also be part of his brother. I mean, Thad occasionally had temper tantrums that he was sort of celebrated for. I think he once put his fist through a taxi window or something like that. I don't know. That's a rumor anyway. But Thad was a bit more, I think, aggressive. Elvin, you know, people always expected Elvin to be some kind of terrifying figure. It's funny, I was going back recently and looking at some liner notes and reviews from the 60s, and every time Elvin would make a record with Earl Hines or somebody like that, you know, the liner notes would be, and you'll be amazed to see, well, there's nothing amazing about it. I mean, Elvin is the complete drummer. He came up playing with all these guys. Just because he found his, you know, his role in the universe with Coltrane didn't mean that he had any less pleasure supporting Johnny Hodges or Pee Wee Russell. He was these are musicians, you know, in their blood, and they love working with other musicians of equal quality, of great figures. They're going to be challenged by it. It's always a challenge. That's what you look for, to work with your peers. And where does this come from? I don't know. It would be interesting to know what their parents knew and how they were raised, and why three brothers should come out of the same family with some 8 years between the oldest and the youngest, and all make major marks in the music of their time, hardly ever playing together, very rarely. Hank occasionally sat in with Thad and Mel. He did some recordings. He and Elvin, you know, did some things. I think they may have been one or two times that the three of them, but very rare. I mean, they really had separate lives. And yet they all have this quality of, when you go to hear them, you just know, you know. I mean, the first time I went to see Elvin play with Cecil Taylor, you know, that was one you really thought, how is this going to go down? And you could just see that Elvin, who played mallets only when he played with Cecil, so had the time of his life. You know, didn't matter. I mean, it mattered. What mattered that he was playing with a great artist who he really respected and was having a good time with. And I think that's the same thing with when Hank would play with guys like Tony Williams, and everybody'd be so surprised. You know, is Tony going to play down? No, that's the thing about the record. Tony is on those cymbals the way he was with Miles. Tony is playing at his peak on those records. Ron Carter's all, and Buster Williams when he was playing bass, they were all over the instrument, but they're not. But Hank is totally with them. He's totally with them. He may not be playing. I don't know if he is or not. I mean, I don't know what Herbie Hancock would have brought to that situation that would have seemed more modern or more au courant than what Hank does. Those are great recordings because they're peas in a pod. They're all they all know that they're each other's peers, and they're really challenged by the material and by each other and by the recording. And you just I think one of the reasons those records caused everybody to rethink Hank was that you could hear the respect that Tony and Ron have for him, because they're not playing down. They're not treating him like, oh, he's some old guy, I better, you know, rein it in a little bit. That does not happen on those records. I think from the time he starts recording, certainly by the early 50s when he records with Charlie Parker, his style is pretty much there. And it doesn't, you know, I love Bud Powell. I think in some ways he's my favorite pianist of all. But when I hear Bud Powell, I know I'm hearing an artist from the 40s. That music defines that era for me. If somebody plays like that today, you know, you say, well, that's the way Bud played. It's a music that belongs to a certain. It's timeless, but it also defines the era that, you know, there are qualities. I think people misconstrue the whole nature of what timelessness really means. It's not a bad thing to define the period in which you're playing. And when you listen to Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 recordings, you know that they could only have been played in the 1920s, but that doesn't take anything away from their emotional magnificence. But Hank Jones does not sound like a player from the 40s. He does not sound like a player from the 50s. He does not sound like a player from the 70s. He has this great melodic gift that you trace back to the pre-war guys. He has the harmonic sophistication of the bebop guys, but he really is his own man in the sense that everything gets filtered through who he is, and it comes out in a way that's lyrical, swinging, He's very swinging. I mean, his time is incredible, but he never pushes the time. It's not like, there are certain musicians. Horace Silver is a great artist. Horace Silver pushes the rhythm, and in that way, he helped to define the piano playing of the 1950s. Herbie, with all those tempo changes that he loves to do, and and all these like sudden, sounds almost comatose at one point, and then he really picks it up, and then the things Miles allowed him to do, and that Ron and Tony could follow him in. It's very much a phenomenon of what was going on in the 60s when they were feeling their oats. I hate to use such a trivial comparison, but with Hank, it's more like the Energizer Bunny, who goes through decade after decade after decade, and whatever situation he plays in, he fits. He more than fits. He makes it better. He elaborates on the music there. There is a true timelessness to his music that I think defines what modern jazz piano playing is. And I think you have to say modern, because there is this Rubicon between the pre and post-war styles. And while I think any pre-war musician who could come back and listen to Hank would totally understand what he's doing, it's a different kind of playing. But in terms of the modern style, this long period, this modern style that's now 60 years with us, for all of the different changes, the avant-garde and soul jazz and West Coast jazz and third stream and all of these other little subtexts, some of them not so little. And the avant-garde may be less a subtext than a kind of parallel universe. But in any of those contexts, Hank Jones has there's nothing tying him down to a particular moment. I mean, if Ornette Coleman called up Hank and said, play with me at a concert, I know that what he would play would work. I don't have any doubt of that. I don't know what, and I don't think he would change much, but one way or another it would fit. And it wouldn't be it wouldn't do any damage to anybody. I can't think of any musician who wouldn't sound better with Hank Jones on the bandstand. I mean, he's just, he's just amazing. He's amazing. I don't ever remember going to see him, and I've seen him many, many times in a lot of different contexts, where his solos weren't sparkling and just full of energy and originality and ideas and fun. And yet I also don't ever remember seeing him where he did anything to call attention to himself. There's a great internal security in that. A lot of musicians who you would see in many, many different contexts, you might say they're chameleonic. But to be a chameleon is to literally change your colors. Hank is not a chameleon. Hank is always Hank. One example that occurs to me now is in 1953, there were two Charlie Parker recording sessions around the same time. One produced Kim, which is a fast virtuoso thing based on Cherokee, and the other one produced the remake of Now's the Time. On the Now's the Time session, the pianist is Al Hay, who's a lot like Hank in a way, in that he also came through the swing guys, but he adapted the bebop suit of clothing. Now, when you listen to that record, you are hearing a musician that you know is part of the bebop generation. He's playing beautifully on it. But again, he's reflecting that moment. When you hear the session with Hank, no, you don't hear that. You don't hear licks. You hear the same guy that you're hearing now. And yet he's, Bird loved him. Everybody who played with him. I think that we are in what academics call a post-historical phase. And those of us who grew up in the historical phase, it's very hard to let go of the idea of jazz as a music that's constantly on the move, because that's what excited us. The fact that you could buy a Pee Wee Russell record or an Ornette Coleman record when you're 15 and somebody says, oh, they're both jazz, and you say, they are? Because there's a lot more distance between those two than, say, Beethoven and Mozart, to my ears. And then you start to really dig in, and you hear so much. There's so much, and it's all under this umbrella called jazz. It's amazing. I mean, Ellington alone, just Ellington in the 20s and Ellington in the 60s, a lot of territory was crossed there. So we're accustomed to these movements and the differences in style and the incredible originality of musicians who have to assert themselves to make their name, to make their way, to get work, to be appreciated, to be in the upper echelon of jazz accomplishment. And now, it's almost unheard of to encounter a young jazz musician who has not come out of the university, which is very different than the university of being on the road, of being apprenticed to a big band, of working in territory bands, of really learning, the ropes. Which is why one reason I think so many records are so boring. When you have these guys, you put them in a session, or you put them in a recording studio, and they've never been in a booth before, and they don't know they're making a record's not the same thing as playing a gig, and they try to fill it up, 80 minutes of music, and they want to write all their own tunes, and the whole art of making an album has sort of disappeared in a way. And also you have these musicians who have gone to school have been, in a sense, trained to do the opposite of what the great figures did. A guy like Roy Eldridge, he told me, he'd listen to this trumpet and this one, and he'd imitate them and learn all their solos, but not publicly. As soon as he got on the band, he would be showing, now look at me. But in school, it could be your homework assignment to transcribe giant steps or play this solo, or that's a very different way of learning the music. Now, I think there are guys who come along, and women now, who have this kind of originality, and I think someone like Jerry Allen, who's been around now for a long time, over 20 years, I think she can probably play in just about any context. I wonder if she'll ever have, the kind of support of, say, a studio type gig. But she does a lot of different things. I was just listening to a record that Andy Bay did where she wrote the arrangements. I didn't know she did that kind of thing before, and she did a very nice job. Who knows where, Bill Charlap is a marvelous pianist. He's a total individual. I don't know, in 20 years, will he be one of those all-purpose people that everybody wants in the group the way Hank does? Part of it is talent, part of it is personality, part of it is the world in which you've been raised. A lot of musicians now will never know what it is to be part of a music that has some kind of national consciousness. It's never been this bad. It's just never been like this before. I'm amazed at the optimism I keep finding in young musicians and even in young producers who think, oh, it's all going to turn around. It's the internet, or it's going to be small labels, or it's going to be this kind of thing or that kind of thing. And yet, you got a guy like Jason Moran, who I think is one of the most talented young musicians to come in a long time. It doesn't matter what he does. There is a glass ceiling, a glass room that he is in. And unless you have access to the machinery of capitalism, you cannot break through it. And if there is no commercial jazz radio, there may be a potential audience of 8 million out there in the red states. They will never know it, and you will never know it, because there's no way that they're ever going to have to hear it. There was far more jazz on television when there were 3 networks than there is now with 200 cable stations. And Columbia and RCA, what used to be Columbia, now it's Sony and BMG, have merged, and both of them have basically gotten rid of their jazz departments. Verve has cut back, which was making all of its money and still from its catalog. The smaller labels don't have the kind of distribution. I don't see how somebody breaks out. I remember Bruce Lundvall calling me after I did a column on Jason and thanking me, and I said, Bruce, why are you thanking me? I've been doing this for 30 years. He said, yeah, but what you don't understand is now you're all we've got left. God, that breaks your heart. And then we were talking about radio, and I said, well, what, BGO? And he said, yeah, but I can't buy an ad on BGO. And it never occurred to me. That's the thing about commercial station. I remember when Miles's In a Silent Way came out. Columbia had ads on that thing on LIB like every half hour. They would have them, somebody from the band would be a guest on the air. They'd give away free albums. They would do this, that, and the other thing. They sold that record, and they prepared you for Bitches Brew. Bitches Brew wasn't an accident. They really, So I don't know if there's going to be, it's impossible to say. I'm amazed that so many young, I listen to some of these guys at NYU, you know, students, graduate students, really talented players. I was amazed at the guys at the Cecil Taylor thing, because I expected the other ones, but I was surprised at how deeply they dug into that music and how much they wanted to be a part of that music. This is great, but I mean, clubs are closing all over the country. This is the last place, and most of the bigger clubs here. Now that I'm not at the Voice, I have this distance that I see things that I didn't quite see, how strict the rotation is. You know, I look at the schedule for certain clubs now every month, and I don't know why it didn't hit. I knew there was a rotation, but I, for some reason, just thought it was more pliable and that there were occasionally new people coming into it. But there's not much of that. You know, it's because their guaranteed audience is tourists. And it's not just that the tourists necessarily know who's on the bill, but they don't want the tourists to be scared away. As what happened, I think I may have mentioned this when David Murray was at Iridium. You know, the tourists just freaked out. They won't go to another jazz club right away.